Okay, I hate to interrupt all the good visiting and fellowship going on, but we need to get started. I've got quite a lot to cover today. In fact, you all promised me you won't tell Carlin this, but I've already decided. I told him I could cover chapters 2 and 3 in 1 month. It's not going to happen. So I'm going to have to beg and plead for an extra week or two. So, like I say, don't tell him that. I want that to be a surprise when it comes from me. But we'll get started this morning. We, of course, are studying the message that Jesus had for 7 real churches in Asia Minor. And we talked about last week why he only had 7 churches, because we know of several others that were in existence that he did not mention by name. And why was it that the 7 was chosen? Very good. First place, all 7 of these churches, if you'll remember, I kind of painted this air picture for you. They're all in like a big old horseshoe, a big loop on a Roman postal road, which made it easy for communication, easy for transportation, and for the Roman legions, easy for moving the troops to keep that area under subjection. Also, what was the other reason that 7 was undoubtedly chosen by the Lord? Complete. And as we talked about, Revelation is written in what we call an apocalyptic genre. And what did apocalyptic, what was that? Very, very popular in the 1st century and the 2nd century and the 3rd century. Revelation. In fact, some of the older Bibles that you have may call it the apocalypse. And what do we say that meant? What is a revelation? It's a future. It's an unveiling, an opening, a revealing. Jesus had a message. The Lord had a message in Revelation. And it's right in this very specific form of writing called apocalyptic. We said it's highly symbolic. It depended on history. It depended on the knowledge that these people had. I talked to you last week. I said some of us were raised with the idea that this was a secret code. It wasn't. And it wasn't because it was so popular. We talked about there are all kinds of apocalyptic writings. In addition, not only to Revelation in the Bible, we talked about 2 other very prominent apocalyptic forms of writing. What were those 2 books, as we call them today? Daniel and Ezekiel. Very apocalyptic, very symbolic. And we said that the key to really understanding this message that Jesus had, not only for those 7 churches 2,000 years ago, but for us today, is to do what? What do we have to do? I'm sorry? Right, exactly right. We've got to go back and say, what was the symbolic message that these people understood? You know, I gave you the example last week. Several of you commented after class. We talk about it raining cats and dogs today. Do any of us go out and look for furry animals falling out of the sky when we say that? No, we know that means what? It's raining hard. And it's the same way a lot of this symbolic language that is in Revelation, they didn't blink. They weren't astounded. They knew what the Lord was saying. And in addition, as I talked about, and I love this, you've really got to have some knowledge of the 1st century history to understand the message. And you'll see that in our study today. You'll see that brought out very, very clearly today, why history was so important, or current events even, were so important for these people. Things that we might not understand, but we go back and we understand what he was saying then we can ascertain as to what he's saying to you and me indirectly today. So we're going today to look at the first of those 7 churches. I had good intentions of looking at both Ephesus and Smyrna today, and like I say, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to get to Smyrna. I'm going to have to hurry to get Ephesus in. Let's talk a little bit about Ephesus. Ephesus was a powerful, mighty city. Now, again, if you'll visualize in your mind, here's the map. Here is the Grecian Peninsula, right here. Here is the Aegean Sea. and here is Asia Minor, or what is today present-day Turkey. And what happened was that Ephesus had grown and multiplied and become very, very powerful. In fact, one historian of antiquity, he says that Ephesus was one of the 3 crown jewels in the Roman Empire's Eastern Empire. Ephesus was a powerhouse of trade, much because of her location. Like I say, she's right down here in the southern part of this part of Asia Minor, right at the confluence of the Mediterranean Sea and the Aegean Sea. There was shipping from all over the world, trade from all over the world. The population was a melting pot of ethnicities because of all this trade. And much of this trade would go east, part of the trade would go west. In fact, another historian said that Ephesus tied the Eastern and Western Roman Empire together. And so you've got this powerful city, this rich city, this proud city. But in addition to that, Ephesus was also the mega center of religiosity in that part of the world. As we shall see in just a minute, there was a temple there to the goddess, I'm using a little g right here, the goddess, anybody know who it was? Artemis. Does anybody know who Artemis was purported to be? The goddess of fertility. And there was this massive temple that had been built there. And it kind of stands to reason because Ephesus is right across the Aegean Sea from Athens. And we all know from the account in Acts what Athens was like when it came to religion. They were what we call polytheistic, which means what? Many gods. Many gods. And the thing is, after the Romans had subjected what had been the Grecian city-states or empire, they adopted all the Greek gods and goddesses. Now, a lot of them they put different names on, but it was the same ones. And they just said, well, if it was good enough for the Greeks, it's good enough for us too. And one of the main goddesses was Artemis. And they had built this massive temple. In fact, y'all have heard of the 7 wonders of the ancient world? This is considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They had a massive, massive 30-something foot stone edifice they had built to Artemis that, according to the Ephesians, had come down from heaven. And literally people from all over the then known world would travel to Ephesus to worship the goddess Artemis. And to say the very least, the worship of this goddess was terribly immoral, terribly promiscuous, horrible. Well, I'm not going to go into any of it. You can study it yourself if you want to. But it was just mind-boggling and revolting, to say the least. Now, why do you think I'm spending some time right here talking about the city of Ephesus itself? Why do you think that matters?
What the church was.
Microphone room.
That was the community, if you or whatever, that the church was in, and whether we like it or not, we are affected by the community or the society surrounding us.
Magnificent point of view. Do you think the Church of Christ in Saginaw is any way influenced, positively and or negatively, by the city of Saginaw? By North Texas? You know, like many of you are aware of the fact, I've preached in some shape, form, or fashion for 44 years. And the 3 major congregations, in fact, the 3 period congregations I preached at through those years, a little rural agricultural town called Gorey, Throckmorton, old-time ranching town north of Abilene, and the Highway 36 Church of Christ in Abilene. Every one of those congregations were different. And the bottom line is, now I'm not talking about doctrinally here, but I'm talking about the mindset and the infrastructure, because Gorey was primarily a little farming town, old farming town. Throckmorton was an old ranching town. Highway 36 was kind of a mixture. We had city folks, we had country folks. Everybody was different. Saginaw is different from any of the ones that I preached at for so long. Because every community is going to influence, have some type of effect upon that community. We're going to see very, very clearly when we go through these 7 churches. They were all radically affected by the community in which they find. And what we've just said about the socioeconomic level of Ephesus, the religiosity of Ephesus, it had tremendous effect on the church of the Ephesians here. And by the way, I might just mention this before we get into the text itself. Do you realize this trivia? Do you realize there's more written to and about the church at Ephesus than any other congregation of the Lord's people in the New Testament? I saw that some time back, and I got to look at it and thinking, could that be right? Well, obviously here in Revelation, Jesus had singled them out to address an issue, a couple of issues that he wanted to talk about. But also, 1st and 2nd Timothy had a direct message to the church at Ephesus. How was that and why was that? Who was what we would call the preacher at Ephesus when Paul wrote those 2 letters? Timothy obviously was, and he was the preacher at Ephesus. Paul had left him there after a missionary journey, after he established the church, to kind of keep it on the right track. And then 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John were all written to Ephesus. Can anybody tell me why that is the case? You want to guess who the 1st century, 2nd century, and 3rd century writers said was the preacher at Ephesus at that point? John. John, before he was exiled to Patmos to bring this message of Jesus in Revelation, was according to early church historians like Irenaeus, says that the preacher was John. And then, of course, there's that long letter that Paul wrote that we call Ephesians. So we see tremendous, the church at Ephesus was a very, very well-known, established church in the New Testament world. So it's no wonder that the Lord might have chosen that to start off his messages here. Now let me just ask you this. Is there anywhere else in the New Testament where there is an episode that's detailed about Ephesus? Can you think of any? Where else in the New Testament is there a lengthy scenario about Ephesus? Perfect. Thank you, sir. Acts the 19th chapter. Let's just go back. Since we're probably not going to get to Smyrna today, let's just take a minute and go back to Acts the 19th chapter. If you have your Bibles or your electronic devices that you use to read the Scriptures, turn back to Acts the 19th chapter. To kind of set the stage, Paul has come to Ephesus. And it's so typical of Paul. Paul is preaching, he's teaching, and he's also doing some magnificent things through the power of Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. If you look at verse 11 of Acts the 19th chapter, God was performing, and I love this word, extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul. Who was performing these miracles? God was, and Paul was the conduit. Paul was the one that was doing it. Well, let's skip on over. Now, most everybody, I think we use this word, they were impressed. Can you imagine what's Paul doing? I mean, if you keep reading on down here past verse 11, you'll see. What was Paul doing? What kind of extraordinary miracles was he performing? Yeah, there are all kinds of infirmities, all kinds of sickness, all kinds of disabilities. Paul was healing these people. And these people realized if they could even touch him with a handkerchief, as you say, they'd be healed. Do you think that would draw any attention? Can you imagine if word got out that tomorrow morning on Business 287, there's a guy, and if you were sick or hurt or crippled in any shape, form, or fashion, he could heal you? You reckon any of us might be in line? This old gimpy fellow would be. And so you can imagine the turmoil in Ephesus. But as we shall see, not everybody was too pleased. Skip down, let's skip down to about verse 23. About that time, there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way. What way is he talking about here? The church, Christianity, following Christ. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis. Now we've already talked about Artemis. This man made idols in effect to worship this Greek goddess Artemis, who was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades, and he said, "Men, you know that your prosperity depends upon this business." What is Demetrius' major concern here? This is cutting into my profits right here, and all the rest of y'all. Pay attention. This guy, now, I'm sure that's true, don't you? If you could go to this elaborate temple with this big old stone statue, or you could be over here and watch this man named Paul help people who've been crippled all their life, or healed of all kinds of diseases, or demons cast out. Which place do you think you might want to be? I think we all kind of understand that, don't we? And we can kind of understand where Artemis is coming from, because nobody's buying his statues. Nobody's visiting the temple of Artemis. And so he is frustrated. He says, these he gathered together of the workmen of similar trades and said, "Men, you know our prosperity depends upon this business. You see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made of hands are no gods at all." Demetrius is trying to be critical. He just paid Paul a tremendous compliment, did he not? What did he just say? What's this Paul doing? All over the world, wherever he goes, he's persuading people that idolatry is not right. And he's showing them a different way. Like I say, I'm sure Demetrius doesn't see himself as complimenting Paul, but he just did. And you see a lesson for us right there? Should that not be the way that you and I are, all Christians are? Wherever we go and whatever we do, we show people the way. If we just had it translated here in the NASB, we show people the way by our lives. We make a difference. He says, not only is there danger that this trade of ours is falling into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all Asia and the world, that's not a exaggeration right now, because people came from all over the then known world to worship her, will even be dethroned from her magnificence. He's number one worried about his pocketbook. Number two, he's worried about the effect it's going to have on the reputation of this goddess. The city was filled with confusion, and they rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. And when Paul wanted to go to the assembly, the disciples would not let him. Why do you reckon they didn't want him to go? They're afraid he's going to be hurt, arrested, or perhaps slain. And when Paul wanted to go, or verse 31, so some of the Asiarchs, anybody have any idea who the Asiarchs were? These were local officials appointed by the Romans. The whole purpose, Rome had a very unique way that the empire had expanded so much, so widespread throughout the then known world, not just around the Mediterranean, but on up into Europe and back into Asia. down into Africa. And they were so big, they could not control their own land. They lived in constant fear of insurrection. We talked about that last week. And so they basically had an understanding with the local officials. We're going to let you remain semi-autonomous. You're going to stay in charge as long as you keep things under control. There's any riots, there's any insurrection, we'll get rid of you and we'll put somebody else in charge. And you see it over and over and over again. In fact, you remember the local Jewish authorities didn't do that. And does anybody remember what happened in AD 70 back in Israel? Jerusalem was sacked. The temple was destroyed. The Jews were dispersed all over the Roman world because they couldn't keep things under control. There was constantly some type of upheaval. Well, we see this in play. Some of the Asiarchs who were friends of his, Paul being, sent to him and repeatedly urged him not to venture into the theater. Now, certainly they were concerned about Paul's well-being, but the main thing they were concerned about, you have a riot, you have anything that resembles an insurrection, what's going to happen to them? They're going to be deposed, and they may lose their lives too. So they want things to calm down. So then some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they had come together. That sounds kind of familiar. I don't know how many of us have seen it, but they had interviews, when the George Floyd riots were going on, when the Palestinian protests were going on, and there was all these masses of people, and they go up to them and say, "Why are you here?" "We're not sure, but we're protesting." "What are you protesting?" "We're not sure, but we're loud." That's what I visualize right here. These people, and you got to believe, who's behind all this? I got to believe Satan's behind all this. I really do, and I'm talking about this particular incident right here. Some of the crowd concluded it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward, and having motioned with his hand, Alexander was intending to make a defense of the assembly. And the context tells us pretty clearly, Alexander is a Jew. He's probably a native of Ephesus, that's conjecture. But he's there and apparently well known, and they put him out and say, "Hey, calm all these folks down. Tell him that it's not the way, it's not Christianity who's causing this problem. There's no intent whatsoever, just to tell people about salvation." But when they recognized that he was a Jew, a single outcry arose from them all as they shouted for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." What all of a sudden do you see happening in Ephesus right here? And we hear it all the time on the news right now. Anti what? You hear it all the time. Anti-Semitism. Suddenly you see the Jews are seen as the problem. And that's going to play a role, as we're going to talk about in just a moment, when we start talking about Jesus' message to the church at Ephesus. After quieting the crowd, the town clerk said, "Men of Ephesus, what man is there, after all, who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of the image which fell down from the heaven? So since these undeniable facts, you ought to keep calm and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our goddess, so that if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against any man, the courts are in session and the proconsuls are available. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you want anything that is beyond this, it shall be settled in a lawful assembly." For just what I told you a minute ago, the Romans didn't want chaos. They wanted peace and quiet and calm. As long as you do that, everything's good. Listen what this official said. "For indeed we are in danger of being accused of a riot, in connection with today's events, since there is no real cause for it, and in this connection, we will be unable to account for this disorderly gathering. He said, y'all, we better calm down. But the mindset's already been established. Keep that in mind when we go back to the second chapter of the Roman letter. When Jesus is bringing this message to the church at Ephesus, because it plays a major role. Any questions or comments before we go back to Revelation, the second chapter? He's got us down, doesn't it? Yes, ma'am.
Some Bibles say Diana, and the other one say Artemis. So why are they cross-mixing them like that?
If memory serves me correctly, Diana was what the Greeks called this fertility goddess. The Romans changed the name, like I said earlier. They changed the name in almost all these gods and goddesses to Artemis. So it's the same, I hate to use the word deity, supposed deity, but same one. Good question though. Thank you for bringing that up. It's probably confusion to a lot of folks. I should have clarified that. But there's like I say, basically every major god and goddess was adopted by the Romans from the Greeks, but everyone changed the names. There were a few minor gods and goddesses that didn't change, but you're talking about, in fact, you remember when Paul's there on Mars Hill? He said, I can't believe all the gods and goddesses you've got here. You've even got one sacrificial altar to what kind of a God that you hadn't even named, God, unknown God. They had so many. And the thing, probably ought to make this point, we've got about 15 minutes before we're through, make it real quick. Do you realize the Romans per se had no problem with Christianity at the beginning? Now that'd blow your mind if you think about it, all we've been taught through the years of the persecution, and it was intense. We're going to see that it's going to get intense. But the Romans don't have a problem with it. You're right. That's just another god. Another god. So as long as that god was not perceived to be a threat to the Roman Empire, they didn't care. I mean, you go back and you start reading about the trial of the Apostle Paul before King Agrippa, the Roman governors, Festus and Felix. What is the big deal? This is just another god. And the trump card that the Jews used to turn the Romans against Christianity was what? This, as they called him in Latin, Jesus Christo. This Jesus Christo claimed to be a king. They're trying to overthrow the Roman government and put him in as king. In fact, you remember when Pontius Pilate says, I don't see anything, let's just flog him and let him go. And they said, if you are a friend of Caesar, you'll do what? You'll execute him. You'll execute him. And so you think about that, they're not too upset until there seems to be the threat of insurrection. Well, let's go to chapter 2 very quickly
Greg,
and get started. Yes,
I want
sir.
to make a slight correction. Artemis is the Greek, Diana is the Roman.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good. Artemis is the Greek, Diana is the Roman. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm not too into Greek mythology or Roman mythology, but okay, let's start with verse 1 of chapter 2. To the angel of the church of Ephesus write. Now, this is a very debatable, contentious point with a lot of people. Some people say that there are what they call guardian angels. Some people say that this is referring to the preacher at Ephesus. It's highly unlikely that either one of those. And because of time restrictions, let me share with you what my mentor, Dr. Ian Fair, said. He said, I feel like you're talking about the Spirit of God in the church. The Spirit, and we'll see this numerous more times. In fact, every one of the 7 churches, he talks about the angel of the church. And so, if you want to visit more with me about that after class, we'll be glad to. but we're not talking about, doesn't seem plausible that that would be an actual guardian angel. God's Spirit. In fact, Jesus is going to make it very plain here in just a minute. I'm with you. I'm with you. In fact, if you'll notice the next thing, the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand. Now, each one of these descriptions that Jesus uses to identify himself has been used back in chapter 1. We didn't spend time in chapter 1, but we have an overview of chapter 1. And so every one of these descriptors that he uses for himself, he's already given back in chapter 1, and all of them were symbolic in meaning. Now, do you remember from last week, we talked about that the Roman emperor, who do we say that was? Starts with a D. Domitian. Now, I'm a whole lot more familiar with that pronunciation than I am the Greek mythology. Domitian. Domitian ruled until the early let's see, AD 81 to AD 96 was when he ruled. And most conservative scholars are convinced that Revelation was written when John's in exile on the Isle of Patmos. We know that from the scriptures. And this would be about AD 95. Now, I told you last week, Domitian, the arrogant Domitian that he was, we know he had a coin struck with his son, his infant son, when we still have evidences of that today from archaeological finds, holding 7 stars in his right hand. And what did we say Domitian was saying to the empire? I and my family, my dynasty, we hold the destiny of the universe. We're in charge. We're in charge. And we said that 7 we talked about last week is symbolic of complete totality. We hold the universe in our hands. We're in charge. What Jesus said to say here? He said the same thing back in chapter 1 we talked about last week. Domitian's not in charge. Domitian is not in authority. I am. And then he goes on, he says, the one who walks among the 7 golden lampstands or candlesticks, some of your translations say, we don't have to guess about the lampstands or the candlesticks, because he just tells us back right there at the end of chapter 1. What does that represent? The churches. The churches. Which is pretty appropriate. Matthew the 5th chapter verse 14. Jesus says, you are the what? Light of the world. These 7 churches were the light of the world. The other congregations were as well. And Jesus says, I walk among you. And he goes on. He says, I know your deeds and your toil. Why do you think that might have been comforting to these Christians? From what we've talked about today, what do you think it was like trying to be a Christian in Ephesus? You've got all this horrible, immoral, promiscuous worship going around you. You've got all of this materialism in a rich, powerful, bustling city. You've got all these people from all over the world and all these different ideas. You've got all the Greek influence, the Roman influence, the religious influence. I'd say they probably had some perseverance. And Jesus says, I know your toil and your perseverance, and that you cannot tolerate evil men, and you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not, and you found them to be false. Now, if we read on back in Acts the 19th chapter, there were some Jewish false teachers that when they saw the positive effect that Paul was having, and all the attention and all the glory that was being leveled for the Lord Jesus Christ, they said, we're with him too. We're with him too. And Acts 19 talks about that. You see any of that in our world today? Oh yeah. People claiming to proclaim the truth who aren't. And that's what he's talking about here. And we're going to see a whole lot more of this as we move through the other 7 churches. He says, you have this against the teachers, but a few things my faithful one who is killed among you where Satan dwells. Okay, Satan dwells. What's he talking about there? Satan dwell on the earth today? Satan dwell on the earth the first century? Satan's real. Satan's alive. And Jesus says, I know that. He talks about the slaying of a saint named Antipas. We don't know anything about him. But I love that fact. He says, you hold fast my name and did not deny my faith even in the days of Antipas. So, great things that these folks are doing. They're denouncing some of these false teachers. They're holding on to the truth in many cases. But then Jesus says, but I have a few things against you. 5 of the churches Jesus makes this statement to. I have a problem here. 2 of the churches, Smyrna and Philadelphia, he doesn't say anything negative to them. But he says this, I have this against you because you have some who hold the teaching of Balaam. You know, I told you last week, you got to have a knowledge of the Old Testament to really get a full grasp of what's going on in Jesus' messages here. Who was Balaam? He was a prophet. Very good, Bill. He was a prophet.
He liked to be a prophet for gain.
Oh, yeah. If I had to, in a very brief, succinct fashion, talk about the problem of Balaam, y'all all remember the story of Balaam. You know, there was a foreign king who came and wanted Balaam to go curse the children of Israel. Well, Balaam knew enough to know, I can't do that. He knew about the power of God. But this foreign king kept upping the ante. I'll give you this, I'll give you this, I'll give you this. Balaam kept saying to his credit, no. But finally, he just can't stand it quite long enough. God says, go ahead and go. Go ahead and talk to him. See what offer he's got. Balaam takes off, and we remember vividly what happened. What happened?
The donkey ran into a wall and started talking to him.
Yeah. That donkey runs him wall. He's beating the donkey. The donkey had more sense than Balaam did, didn't he? Because there's an angel standing there in the walkway, the pathway, and Balaam doesn't see it, but the donkey does. You know, that was one thing that I learned a long time ago in my cowboy days. My horse always saw and smelled a whole lot more than I did. So he started shouting, you better pay attention. Balaam didn't heed that warning. Balaam just wanted to keep going. And finally his eyes were open, the scripture says. He sees an angel with that sword there. The donkey talks to him. You think the Lord got Balaam's attention? But if you had to talk about, again, in a succinct way, Balaam's real problem, and that's not the only place we read about Balaam, he compromised. He knew what God told him, don't go to this foreign king. But he kept saying, well. And later on we find out Balaam led the children of Israel into immorality. And he led them into idol worship. He compromised. Now, not totally did disown God. You see any of that in our society today? Compromise? You see that sometimes in brotherhood? Compromise? Oh, yeah. It's still there. And so what he's saying here is that some of you folks in Ephesus are guilty of compromising your faith. And he goes on, he says, but I have this against you, that you have left your first love. What do you think he's talking about there? Left your first love.
His loyalty to the Lord is what he's talking about. His loyalty to the Lord, they had left it and went out to do other things more pleasant to their minds.
Very good. With all of the materialism in Ephesus, some of these people had probably fallen back into the materialism and back into the immorality and back into the idolatry that was so prevalent in Ephesus. Again, do you think that may be a problem in our society today? Do you see a message to us? Don't compromise. Don't become wishy-washy. Stay with the truth. Then he goes on and says, therefore remember that which you have fallen, and repent and do the deeds you did at first, or else I am coming to you and will remove your lampstand out of its place unless you repent. Again, because of time considerations. You're not going to be a light unto the world anymore if you keep compromising, if you don't stand firm in the faith. Yet you do have this, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. We don't know much about the Nicolaitans, but again, it seems that this is the same term in the New Testament they used as Balaamites in the Old Testament. And as we've just talked about Balaam, the chief problem with the Balaamites or the Nicolaitans were people that what? I'm sorry? Compromised. Very, very good. They compromised. They weren't true to the faith. We see it in the Old Testament, we see it in the New Testament, we see it in the 21st century as well. So again, a message for us as well. Then he makes a statement, verse 7, that he makes to all 7 churches, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. That's pretty clear. What did you say? Listen. Listen. Read. Understand. And put it into effect. I tell a story years ago when I was a kindergarten principal. I had a little boy. He was something else. The teacher would bring him in. He didn't pay any attention to you. And she said, I want you to get his attention. Yes, ma'am. So I was talking to him. He was looking around, not paying a bit of attention. And finally, I said, do you hear me? He said, of course I hear you. You're loud. That's the best part of my education career, those 10 years I was a kindergarten principal. But anyway, sometimes I'm afraid I may be that way with the Lord. Of course I hear you. You're loud, but I'm not paying attention. To him who overcomes, real important, to overcome throughout Revelation, a synonym for that in Revelation is conquer. He who conquers, he who overcomes, both of them means is you're faithful regardless of what it costs you. He who conquers, he who is faithful regardless of what it costs you, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. We see that same reference to a tree of life in the 22nd and final chapter of Revelation 2, when he brings it all into focus. I want you to pay attention, Jesus said, because if you do, the dividends are unbelievable. Real quick questions. I do want to say, you remember last week I quit 2 minutes early? Well, I ran 2 minutes over today, so we're still even.